Good evening, everyone, and namaskar to all. First of all, I welcome everyone to this meeting, and I especially thank Professor Subhrendu Pattanayak from Duke University for kindly accepting our invitation to deliver the talk on this World Environment Day, and he will be talking on the planetary health crisis and can economists get their hands dirty and help. Today the world is celebrating the 50th World Environment Day, and this year the theme is beat the plastic pollution. And in this, to set the context of this meeting, recently, multiple reports have come up. Some of them would be like the important report would be the AR6 of IPCC assessment report 6 of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the Economics of Biodiversity, chaired by Parthadas Gupta. So these reports have warned us that the climate change is happening and it is induced by the human activities. And Sir Parthadas Gupta has mentioned in his report that the biodiversity is degrading fast, and this is unsustainable. And similarly, the UNEP in its website has mentioned that if the present consumption of the planet Earth continues, then by 2050 we will require three planets to fulfill the human consumption, and we do not have obviously three planets Earth. So that means the human consumption has exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet, and that's how we need to slow down. And we'll be listening to Professor Subhrendu Pattanayak on this topic in details. And so let me also speak a few words about the Odisha Economic Association. The Odisha Economic Association was formed in the 1968, and now it is 55 years old association. The association has been organizing annual conferences every year, and also after COVID-19, we have been organizing different webinars on different themes. And Odisha Economic Association also publishes a journal, Odisha Economic Journal, which is enlisted in the UGC care. And we are also trying hard to get it enlisted in the Scopus. So Odisha Economic Association has now about 770 live members, and the present president is Professor Dr. Jugal Kishore Mahapatra, the former Chief Secretary of Odisha. I request him to preside over this meeting. And so, with this brief note about the Odisha Economic Association and about the World Environment Day, I now request the President of Odisha Economic Association, Dr. Jugal Kishore Mahapatra, to give his introductory remarks. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Amarendra. First of all, let me extend a very hearty welcome to Professor Pattanayak to this forum. The day is very apt, and possibly the speaker is more well matched to the theme that we have decided to discuss today. Professor Pattnayak's credentials are absolutely enviable, I could say, in the field of environment, energy, climate change, forestry, natural resources. So I think he has a wealth of research into these areas, and we couldn't have possibly chosen a better person to deliver this talk today, this special lecture today. So it's a delight. The topic is extremely, provocative in a sense and very interesting. I'm sure all the participants would find it extremely engaging. With that, I think let's formally introduce Professor Pattanayak to the forum of OEA.
Yes, I now invite Professor Sikta Singh to formally introduce the speaker. Over to you, Dr. Sikta.
Namaskar, sir. Namaskar, everyone. A very good evening and a very good morning, sir. We are really privileged to have amidst us Professor Subhrendu Pattanayak, who is the Oak Professor of Environmental and Energy Policy at Duke University. His studies on the causes and consequences of choices people make regarding the natural environment in low and middle income tropical countries in order to help design and evaluate policies have been a very, very glaring work which has been very highly appreciated. His research is in three domains at the intersection of environment and energy, taking up household energy, environmental health, and forest ecosystem. His focus is on the design of institutions and policies which are motivated by the enormous inequities and arrays of efficiency concerns pertaining to externalities, public goods, and imperfect information and competition. Professor Patnaik approaches these problems through a very efficient statistical modeling with high resolution objective data collected in the field, as well as through SLR and meta-analysis. He primarily uses data to test hypotheses salient to policy manipulation, developed both from economic frameworks, stakeholders, discussions, and direct observations in the field. He employs empirical method that uses quasi-experimental or experimental variation captured through household surveys. He typically matches these surveys with mesoscale secondary statistics and estimates econometric models to generate policy insight. Professor Patnaik has collaborated closely with multilateral NGOs and government as well as local academics in the low and middle income countries. Along with that, Professor Pattanayak has led multidisciplinary PhD training program at Duke University, and he is also a fellow and faculty member of South Asian Network of Development and Environmental Economists. He has received his PhD in environmental economics from Duke University. To cite few of his works, I must say, sir, I am intrigued. Really, I was going through few of your articles. They are absolutely, sir, we have a lot to learn from you with more than 150 publications. Sir, we are indeed really happy and honored to have you with us. So we'll be taking up through a session on the planetary health crisis. Can economists get their hands dirty and help? So eagerly waiting to hear from you, sir. Over to you and welcome again. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's over to you, Professor Pattanayak.
Okay. So can you firstly all hear me fine?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Very
Yes,
clear.
indeed.
Fantastic. So I think the honor is entirely mine. I just wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to give this talk, and especially on World Environment Day. I think I've pretty much spent my entire professional life working on environmental issues, but very much using economics. So I think of myself as an ambassador of economics to the world of climate, biodiversity, forests, air pollution. And so not so much to invent new economics, but take the very basic principles of economics and apply it. And a lot of that work has been actually done in Odisha. So I will not be talking about that much today. I will show you a little glimpse, but I wanted to thank Amarendra and Chandrasekhar, who connected us, and the Odisha Economic Association for inviting me today. So with that, there are lots and lots of people to acknowledge, and this will be a slightly different talk than what you may or may not be used to. There is no one paper that I want to talk about. It's drawing on, it's hard to admit, about 30 years of work at this point in life. So the lessons are from all kinds of domains, and I'll pull on that. And I must admit that in my mind, when you get these invitations, you're thinking of what should you focus on. So I have a lot of things swirling in my head, but I have tried to organize the main points on the first slide. After that, if I forget, it's okay, as long as you get the main lessons from the first slide. That's the main point. Yeah. So hopefully there is no IT glitch. Amarendra and I were testing this last night. I like to test things, and You can see me moving slides there. I can't entirely see you because my entire screen is used up by this presentation. So I will give you some glimpses of how the world is falling apart. But I think you know that the summer temperatures are becoming unbearable. It's very hard to in the winter to walk outside in New Delhi. This is not just a North India problem. This is now there are droughts and floods, and so the planet is at risk. And unfortunately, this is not something to be proud of. South Asia is high on that list of one of the most endangered places, and India is no exception. And of course, India also has the resources to do something about it compared to some of the other places. But nonetheless, air pollution, whether that's indoor or outdoors, is a big issue in in Asia and India. And so I'll draw on some examples from that. There is not this group, perhaps because some of you are skilled at using economics on environmental problems. But for better or for worse, some people say, what does economics have to do with the environment? Well, I think what we will do or say or claim is that we have better data, careful methods, and more rigorous ways of asking, hopefully, policy relevant questions. And here I'm going to make the push that some of the work that we should be doing is to play to our strengths. When programs, policies, projects that are going to help deal with this planetary health crisis have to be implemented, that implementation has to be tested, and it can be tested using scientific methods. And here economists can be good at specifying and testing these implementation challenges. So today's example will focus on what do households prefer? What kind of constraints do they face? The supply ecosystem, whether that's governments or firms or NGOs, are they contributing to those constraints? And so that's where I think economists can have the biggest mark on the environmental problem. I think some economists have gone a little astray and they focus too much on trying to do better epidemiology or better ecology, saying, oh, those epidemiologists don't seem to understand how to show health is declining. I think that is not really our comparative advantage, to use another economics concept. We are much better placed using social science problems and questions and sort of bringing the same rigor, same data, same methodology to these more policy-oriented questions. That's where I would say, we have the most potential. So I think if we do that, we can help avoid what I would call type 3 errors. So there's a lot of focus in economics on type 1 and type 2 errors in statistics, the false null and those two, alpha and beta. But I think in the process, with that obsession about statistical significance, we have sort of lost sight of economic significance, and we are precisely answering many pointless questions. This, I would say, is a type 3 error, and it should be minimized. And towards the end of the talk, and hopefully beyond just the technicalities of the work that I will talk about, I can say that one way to avoid these type 3 errors is potentially by making science that is more inclusive. There is a push towards decolonizing science, decolonizing economics. And the Odisha Economic Association is one forum that creates the opportunity for more grounded, local, coherent science that is relevant to the region, but also when it's co-produced with the practitioners and implementers. And I will refer to this, and perhaps in the question and answers can help deal with some of the major questions here. Of course, it means that from the old models, when I was in graduate school and talking to my professors, very few of them actually went to the field. Okay. They stayed in classrooms. They went to meetings in the South Block or North Block, or sometimes they would go to a conference center and present, but they didn't actually get their hands dirty or their shoes dirty in this case. Okay. And I think that that leads to asking sometimes irrelevant questions, and the world has changed. Many of the faces I'm looking at are from this new wave of field-based economists, and these types of people will and those of you who are in the audience will perhaps understand why, when you get suggestions to go to the field and understand what is going on, it is mostly from this goal to help you avoid type 3 errors and avoid pointless questions, because we are running out of time. We are literally running out of time to protect the planet right now, and so we just have to produce reasonable answers very quickly. So I will illustrate this idea through an example from the Himalayas, where we were promoting electric cooking and trying to understand why there are barriers. And this approach of diagnosing the problem, designing some solutions, and then empirically testing it using randomized controlled trials or other quasi-experimental methods, this go slow and learn deep approach is an example of implementation science that I wish more of my colleagues did. Many are doing, but I wish even more were doing, so that we can close this gap between what we know from the science and what practitioners are doing. This no-do gap is too big. There's lots and lots of programs, projects, and policies that are being done out there, and they don't seem to have much scientific basis. And there's good reasons that they don't have scientific basis, because the scientists are studying things that are too obscure and too irrelevant sometimes, okay? Because they are appealing to their peers and trying to satisfy others. So that really is the gist of my presentation. And now in about 42 minutes or 40 minutes, I will run through 60 slides. So it'll look like you're running on a fast train, as if you're flipping through a magazine. But believe me, if you want to discuss any point in detail, these are questions and issues I've been pondering for many years. And some of my colleagues have also joined, and perhaps they will weigh in if pulled into the discussion. So thank you again to the association for inviting me. And now I'm going to speed up and run through a lot of technical material, okay? So most of the work that I will be talking about is in this publication and the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's joint with environmental scientists, atmospheric scientists, as well as practitioners, leaders of NGOs, and lots of students and co-authors. And really the bigger paper from that is just coming out. Well, those of you who published in the Review of Economics and Statistics, the backlog is about 3 years. So this paper has been around for a long time, but it doesn't seem to have come out in press yet. And it is very much focused on the role of ground level organizations in the effectiveness of interventions, of policy solutions, and something that I didn't necessarily learn in this context, but in some other work that I've done on biodiversity and forests and sanitation, including in Odisha, where NGOs play a big role. And so this formally tests that. But where did it all begin? So this idea of planetary health is, to some extent, the public health community, mostly in this group. I think everybody else in that list of co-authors on this Lancet Commission was a doctor or a biomedical professional or an environmental scientist. I think I was the only social scientist there. And my role here was to explain that we've been thinking about this in sustainable development terms for a long time. So the environment has something to do with health. And but solving that requires focus on policies and projects, not just saying that the environment has something to do with health. So let's focus on the solutions, not on the problems. But of course, I was the most junior person in that group of old doctors, and I was also the only social scientist, so no one really listened to me. That said, they didn't throw me off the list, and so I was able to make a couple of points in there. Basically, this idea of planetary health is tied to this idea of planetary boundaries, whether it is climate change or biodiversity integrity or freshwater use or atmospheric aerosol loading. We seem to be hitting some of these limits. And once we hit the limits, all hell will break loose. And so, of course, Amarendra and Professor Mahapatra and others had referred to Partha Dasgupta, who has pushed us to examine this question: are we depleting our natural capital in the process of trying to make our lives happen today? And so the question is, what is the value that is being lost? And is the loss greater than the gains we are having from the way we live our lives today? Okay. I think those are important questions. And given how far we have dug ourselves into a hole, someone has to make that point. But I am far too impatient. I think it's time to actually focus on the projects, policies, programs that can protect natural capital and show that there is perhaps a high rate of return. Sometimes they have high rate of returns. Sometimes they have poor rates of returns. And this is the kind of busy work that applied economists can do to help the policymakers choose between the different projects, policies, and programs that are out there. It's not enough to point out there is a problem. We really have to work on the solutions. And that's really where most of my career has gone, and several of you are already doing that. So the background is, of course, many things over the last 200 years is improving. Poverty is going down, population is increased, life expectancy is increased, life is good. And is that true? Well, tropical forests are disappearing fast, water is running out, ocean is full of acid, biodiversity is declining, temperature is changing like it has never changed before. So life is not so good, maybe. Okay. What is that balance? And when you have all those kinds of ecosystem changes, it is hard to understand this, but some of our, I think people mentioned Sandy, and I will refer to some Sandy at the end of this presentation. Some of our Sandy grantees have shown that these heat waves in Odisha have caused all kinds of damages. That's Saudamani's work, and others as well. So these environmental changes actually affect health directly, indirectly, and also through ecosystem-mediated effects. And many natural scientists and epidemiologists are good at answering these questions. Some economists have got into this, partly because preventing those damages are costly. And so do the costs exceed the benefits? This is classic public economics. What kind of programs can we put in place to avoid these environmental changes? People have computed that the environment is approximately 25% of the health problem in the world. Okay. You think of food, you think about smoking, you think about lifestyle, too much oil, too much pota pita, whatever you want to eat, and that's causing all this diabetes. But really, just the air and the water and the ecosystem, big diseases like malaria, dengue, cardiovascular, respiratory effects, and especially amongst children, 25% or more of those diseases and health problems come from changes in the environment. Some people have worked on that. I have tried to contribute to that. And unfortunately, the health ministry doesn't talk to the environment ministry. The environment ministry doesn't see health as an outcome, or that's not what they want to focus on. And so science has gone into proving how big this number is. Okay. But then the Planetary Health Commission was a little bit disappointing. So, because they were all about, we have a problem, and the things we can do to solve that is, this is where it gets silly: reduce food waste, have healthy diets, engage in better governance, learn about planetary health, engage in family planning and deforestation. Okay, we've known about this for a long time. How? Okay. Yes, we have a problem, but there is little analysis from these biomedical scholars and public health on projects, policies, programs that can reverse the environmental damage. For example, if bees are disappearing and pollination is going down, what kind of programs, policies can prevent that? And it was hard to get them from just pointing out there was a problem to identifying solutions that were cost effective and that policymakers could use. And so I think that's where economists have the biggest possible influence, not by proving that bees are disappearing, which some economists are doing, and that pollination is good for agriculture, which also some economists are doing, but instead, what are the things that are causing the bees to disappear, and are there policies, programs, and projects that can reverse that? Okay. So the reason we have this crisis is partly that we are unable to imagine the link between the environment and the economy. Partha Dasgupta has again made this point, and I'll refer to his work briefly. There is also a problem because we don't actually have good numbers on how the environment and climate and human health and human well-being is related. So the usual kinds of problems, interdisciplinary research is difficult, the resources available are not there. But today I want to really focus on the implementation of the solutions that has its own failures. And really most of my talk is pushing that, and why are we in this hole where we have great ideas. Oh, let's do carbon taxes. But we haven't thought through how you would implement a carbon tax. If anyone can take one tax and accept it, the political acceptability of this to start with, okay? The ground level challenges of putting these things in place are something that someone else is supposed to solve. The problem is we don't treat their solution as also a scientific process where there are some things will work, some things won't work. And this is where I think we can have a huge effect, huge impact. What is the imagination failure? Well, the fact that all this damage, climate change loss, biodiversity loss, land conversion, is basically destroying our social foundation. It is leading to gender inequality, social inequity, lack of political voice, that somehow the social fabric is disconnected with these overshoots we have on the planetary health, right? So Kate Roth has talked about this, trying to find that balance between ecological safety and social justice, okay? So this idea of sitting in that space in between this upper limit and the lower limit is a donut, and it can act as a compass to guide us. Of course, from that high level, people like Partha, yes, sorry, he's a Sandy. He was the founder of Sandy, so we talked about Sir Partha is Partha. Okay, that's what he is to us. One reason we are off track here is because we are using indicators when ministers are arguing with each other. They're talking about GDP. Really, GDP is a very poor indicator of most things. You can attack it in many different ways. But the word gross domestic product, the word gross itself is a pretty bad characterization of how to measure progress of society, progress of any economy. And so the fact that it doesn't recognize property rights for the environment, the fact that nature has been providing subsidies, whether those have been accommodated, how are they even calculated in any of these accounts? So really, we should be thinking about other indicators like genuine wealth, and that becomes a great framework for the kind of ground level applied micro work that many of us end up doing. Because to do this new calculation of wealth, I mean, he and his colleagues, Ken Arrow and others, literally just made up these numbers. They don't have a good way to calculate many of these other indicators for genuine wealth. And they need the work by some of us to sort of show what natural capital depreciation, how to account for that, okay? Now, whether you use an accounting system or other ways. So for example, from imagination failure, let's move to knowledge failure. What kinds of pieces of information are missing? So there's some work we've done in the Brazilian Amazon on how the loss of forests actually leads to disease, and protection of forests protects against infectious diseases like malaria, respiratory infections, and diarrhea. Okay. Similarly, some work in Indonesia, another big source of another very important forest ecosystem. when that is cleared for economic activities such as oil palm, which is an extremely lucrative and important industry, we don't fully account for the human capital losses, which is not just the death of people from smoke, but the fact that the smoke covers the fetus and the fetus doesn't grow to its full capacity. Children are short, they earn less money. So we pay for this in some offside, so these nature's externalities are playing out, and it's not in the calculus of programs and policies to promote oil palm in Indonesia, for example. Likewise, I did quite a lot of work in Odisha on sanitation. Sanitation is not viewed as a human capital investment. Okay, it's viewed as something dirty. Firstly, we don't want to talk about it because it's sanitation and defecation, and these are difficult topics. But the fact that it has something to do with there's so much interest in education that when girls study, when girls have access to sanitation, not only do they have fuller lives. So in this first paper in Economic Development and Cultural Change, we show that their arm circumferences are bigger, their body mass indicators are better, their height, weight, those kinds of ratios. So you see literally nutritional effects. And those nutritional effects in turn have some effects for long-term cognition. And it helps close the gender gap. So girls end up doing better than boys, even though they start out behind boys, if they are exposed to better sanitation at some point in their lives. Okay. And also from that same study, that it's very hard to sustain this appropriate sanitation. That's partly because peer effects are very strong. And so policies and programs and ground level implementation have to be constantly in play to offset these peer effects. All of us follow what the others are doing. And that's true also in the use of toilets. Okay. So those are examples of the kinds of research that people are doing, knowledge failure. But I really, in the remaining 20 minutes, I want to pivot to this idea of implementation science, and it's the idea that we don't think hard about implementation. Okay. The leader of this Lancet Commission, Sir Andy Haynes, he's a highly decorated scientist from the UK, actually did understand my comments about implementation, and some of these ideas were initially in a companion piece we wrote on implementation. And the gist of this is literally that we find a problem like the planetary health crisis. We think about some solutions, but we don't fully think about how those solutions will get implemented. Okay, so compared to older public health problems like John Snow's discovery of what caused diarrhea. So there was pollution in the water and that was causing contamination. Today's problems there's a whole host of factors that is, for example, responsible for pollinator loss, land use change, pesticides use, climate change. So the solutions are more complicated, and the solutions actually require effective institutions, clear incentives, and good governance. And the answers to that lies in a good understanding of political science, certainly economics and business, because markets have a role to play, but also a deep appreciation of sociology, anthropology, and psychology, because attitudes, beliefs, culture, that all plays a role in why pollinators are disappearing. And this is where social scientists can help deal with the climate crisis or the planetary health crisis. And economists in particular, especially if they respect what the other disciplines are doing, can help understand what is happening. So just to say, subsidize something because the price matters or offer income is not enough, because sometimes the norms overpower whatever subsidies you do. Okay. Or corruption levels are too high, or the local institutions don't have the capacity. So I think sometimes our solutions are too simplistic, even when we engage, and partly because we don't acknowledge that it's a multifaceted problem here. Okay, so as usual, because we are looking at planetary health and it cuts across so many different scales, the context actually matters. So we can get the context right by listening to those program managers, the practitioners, the implementers who are trying to put programs in place to deal with this. And in addition to listening to them, co-producing the science with them. So does that mean co-opting and producing the results they want? I've been at it for 30 years. Not once have I had to change any finding because whoever was funding it or whoever was supporting it or doing programs, like in Odisha when we were doing the sanitation campaign, working with the Secretary of Rural Development and the ministry did not in any way influence the work we were doing about what effects we would find from sanitation. Of course, we have to convince ourselves and our co-authors and the referees and editors that high theory is not enough. Good work on implementation should be published. Centers should exist to value implementation and this work. And ultimately, to honor and acknowledge and promote the competitive advantage that local scholars have, both in understanding which contexts are relevant, but then whether the solution that we found is locally salient. Okay, so building local capacity so that they can, many problems are context specific, but so you need local scholars who can understand that context. Okay. I'm going to now, if I wasn't speaking fast enough, I'm going to speak even faster to get to the technical point in a second here. So part of the reason we have this gap between what researchers know and what practitioners do is there are many reasons, but this does make it difficult to do policies and programs that are science-based. And this is a particular problem in the places that have the biggest planetary health problems, okay? And there's all kinds of reasons, and there's long articles that have been written about why the world of practice and research doesn't talk to each other. I will not try to summarize that. Maybe in the Q&A, I'd be happy to engage in why that exists. I can just urge you that we have to help close the gap. But our scholarship has to, while some people can be advancing high theory and perhaps science for the sake of science, some subset of us have to really work on the real life projects and problems out there, okay? And until we do that, we'll continue to be in the dark, and implementation will remain an afterthought, and we'll get really bad policies on the ground. That's what will happen. So yes, there are type 1 and type 2 problems, but really we should be trying to answer what is the right problem, okay? And others have talked about this. I am not the first to bring this up, but my goal right now, every seminar I hear from a PhD student, from a young professor, is to ask them, why did you ask this question? Who wants to know the answer to this? What will you do once you have this answer? Who cares? How is it relevant? And sometimes they have good answers and sometimes they don't. And it's a good thing to get into their heads. And that's what I want all of us to be thinking about, okay? So my colleague Gunnar Colin, who heads the EFD, has come up with this hippo elephant doctrine, which is we have to stop being hippos and become elephants. So what does that really mean? We need big ears and small mouths, so we have to talk less and listen more. Now, this is a bit ironic because I've been talking and not really listening, and hopefully I'll stop talking soon and be listening to what you have to say about what I have to say. But I think you understand where I'm going with this. Before launching research, we just have to do a lot of homework to review the landscape of policies, projects, and practices so we can generate the evidence around the practice base. Not tell the practitioners, wait for our study to be over, and it's going to take 10 years between conception to publication, and then we'll tell you what you should do. In the meanwhile, the planetary health crisis will get a lot worse, right? So And then that involves lots of consultations. And the experts don't just sit in governments or in universities. They are there in local NGOs, they're in civil society. So lots and lots of conversations. Bring the practitioners and policymakers into the design of the project. Bring them in early, not just at the end stage when we have a finding. We say, can you use this? Is this a good idea? They might say, well, you should have asked a different question, and maybe then we could have used it. Okay. And of course, not stop. How many times I have to argue with my students and junior colleagues about just because you published a paper doesn't mean anything. It means that 2 referees, 1 editor, and maybe 3 friends read it. No one else is going to see it. You have to do the hard work of writing about it and blogging about it. Yes, it sounds like you are showing off, but you put 10, 20 years in some of the cases of some of my papers into this idea. I think you owe it to the process to disseminate it. But just remember, the world is listening to Taylor Swift and watching IPL, and they don't have time. You're competing with those people. And one publication in a small journal is just not enough. We have to do the extra work of disseminating the finding. But the finding is not going to be relevant unless the policymakers were involved at the design of the question, because they will tell you that that's not what we wanted answers to. Okay. So now I'm going to pivot to this study to illustrate how we did something like this in the Himalayas. The study in Odisha on sanitation was very much in the same spirit. It took 4 or 5 years to launch the study, and then 15 years later, we are still publishing from that study because there's all kinds of ramifications of changing the sanitation options for some people. Yeah. So cooking with biomass fuel is a bad idea. So firewood, dung, leaves, partly because it has climate effects. That same smoke gets into the sky, it melts glaciers. It has regional environmental effects, not just pollution, but also the forest is degraded at a faster rate than it can generate. What has drawn most attention is, of course, the health of women and children who are around the fire while the cooked food is being produced. But also the drudgery that women have to primarily bear of bringing the firewood to their houses. So for all kinds of reasons, clean cooking solutions, whether that's an improved biomass stove or gas or electric stoves, solve all kinds of externalities. And many social scientists, including economists, are trying to measure the size of these effects so that they can hopefully use them to compute costs and benefits and come up with good policies. I'm much more interested in, let's take for granted that an electric stove is good or LPG is good, which let them prove that it's not so good, but eventually they will prove this point. If clean air is clean and a clean stove gives you clean air, how are we going to get those programs for stoves implemented? What motivates households, communities, NGOs, retailers, governments? What kind of incentives do they face? What institutions are they based in? What governance is required so this scales up? Okay. And in this paper, we focus on the interaction between households and NGOs, but in other work, we've looked at other kinds of actors in this domain. Okay. So after lots of simulations, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to get through this, and hopefully we can do some of this in the Q&A. After lots of simulations, desk reviews, systematic reviews, some model building, okay, I'm just telling you that this is based on 5 years of work. Thinking about institutions, lots and lots of focus groups, lots of field experiments in actually 3 states, in Odisha, in Uttar Pradesh, and in Uttarakhand. We were ready to pilot some ideas, and we again don't have time to describe those pilots because I want to focus on this issue of how NGOs make a difference. We piloted different kinds of stoves, so the product itself, different kinds of pricing, Because you can think about liquidity constraints, different kinds of places, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, and Uttarakhand, different kinds of institutions delivering those in different places. NGOs are active, non-active, different kinds of promotion strategies. So those of you who are closer to the business world will recognize this as Kotler's social marketing, the 4 Ps. And after all that piloting, we discovered, for one, that NGOs make a big difference, okay? NGOs make a big difference to whether promotion campaigns are effective or not. So that was one of the lessons we learned from this piloting. So after quite a bit of desk work, theoretical work, many cups of tea, and in India, when you drink that much tea, you almost get diabetes at the end of that because of the sugar content in the tea. 2,000 household surveys, 8 pilot interventions. We learned that stoves are a complicated product. The taste or the preferences for that is heterogeneous. It really matters where and who is able to deliver them. It was important to establish a supply chain so that we could also ease income and liquidity constraints. And finally, we designed an experimental supply and demand intervention, and you'll see that in a second, where there was in-house delivery of the cook stoves. There was a demonstration for what the product is. There's a finance option, and there was a choice. There's an actual choice. And again, in the Q&A, I can explain why this is easy or not, for why these are important facets to focus on. But one of the most important things we did here was to stratify our experiment promotion by communities where NGOs had been active and communities where they had not been very active, because we, again, believe that local institutions make a big difference. Let me take a pause. I see some chatter in the text about not being able to hear me. I just want to make sure that you can, because we've tested this a few times, and
No, it's audible. It's audible. Go ahead.
okay.
No issues.
Thank you.
Also, Professor Patnaik, you can take some extra time also. Don't be in a hurry to.
Okay.
Our listeners would be delighted to, if you continue for some extra time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So that's a good cue to slow down a little bit, and I will talk about this experimental study, which in a sense is an example of this policy-focused implementation research that I've been pushing for, where locals are involved, local scholars are involved, local practitioners are involved, and hopefully we produce an answer that, or set of answers that has more traction than just this experiment in the Himalayas, okay? So here is the experimental design. There are 2 sets of communities. Just think about 50 hamlets where an NGO was active, and 50 hamlets where it has never worked. And we take that information and we muddle it up so that you can't see, except for the co-PI and me, no one else in the study team knew where the NGOs were active. And then we run a randomized controlled trial where there are multiple things going on. So for 2/3 of the sample, they're exposed to a treatment where different kinds of subsidies are provided, in-house delivery, financing options, demonstration projects. So relaxing a lot of constraints, okay? And then we track these households across time. First measurement, August 2013. Second measurement, November 2013. Third measurement, November 2014. Eventually, the donors and funders lost interest in supporting us. Otherwise, we would have kept going. As you can see from the Odisha study, we've been talking to those households now for 20 years. Okay. Of course, you may wonder how. So we do technical, rigorous work, and so how do we know that the NGO communities are similar to the non-NGO communities? Well, we do a form of pre-matching, where we list all the communities where the NGOs was active in Uttarakhand. And in general, we find that the NGO was more active in some sets of communities. So we look through the census to find exactly those kinds of communities that are not part of the NGO sphere of influence, but have almost similar characteristics. Okay. So is this form of propensity score matching, but more as a pre-processing of the data to create more like apples to apples. Okay. So that we can have a comparison. And as we show in the paper, and it's available from the journal website, you can see that whether it's an NGO village or a non-NGO village, across many characteristics at the household level, there are almost no differences. So we did a reasonable job of finding communities that are comparable. Okay. And this holds out when we do not just at the village household level, but also at the village level. So what this means is the normalized value for any outcome in column 1 is not that different from the normalized outcome for non-NGO village reported in column 3. But of course, these are small tables and you can hardly see them. But please ask me for a copy of the paper if you cannot get it from the journal website. Okay. And so having that information, we still do our campaign to promote cook stoves, that is information, demonstration, relaxing liquidity constraints, and lowering income constraints, okay, by offering subsidies. So we do want to know what is the price sensitivity, but we also know that you have to inform people, sort of brainwash them, and make things easy by delivering things at their house. All of us like food that is delivered at our house. We are happy when it's cheaper. All those same sorts of things are applying to stoves here. Okay. So these are the main results. And I'll take a few minutes at the end to sort of put this in context. In the left panel, at 3 points in time, 2013, early first follow-up, late 2013, second follow-up, end of 2013, 2014. In the control communities that did not get this treatment, traditional stove use, that is the dirty way of cooking or not clean way of cooking, remained more or less constant. It changed from 74 to 62%. Well, India is prospering, so 12% change is the baseline change in LPG uptake, which you see is going up from 26 to about 38%. So that's almost all. LPG, Modi's scheme had not been launched, but this was at the beginning of that. Okay. Now, here is the treatment communities. Okay. So remember, in the first column, so the first versus fourth column, there were almost as many traditional stove users, and just look by the end of the period. That group had been decimated. It had almost been halved from 71% to 37%. Okay. Now they were using LPG, the electric stoves, only electric, only the improved stoves, some combination of stoves. And over time, we had been able to prove what some other economists had not shown. In fact, there was a study in Odisha that shows clean cook stoves go up in smoke. Now, I think that was not the right message to take away from that study, because they didn't focus on implementation. They were trying to show that clean stoves should have health effects, but they didn't ever incentivize the households to adopt those. That study was done in Berhampur by some JPAL scholars, Esther Duflo, Michael Greenstone, and Rima Hanna. But I think it gave the wrong message about the effectiveness of these kinds of technologies. And so our study, in contrast, shows that it is possible to achieve high ownership and use in low-income settings. But what about this is about implementation? So part of it is the slow way in which we developed this study to think about what the real problems were, who could work with us, why would people care, can we convince them to change their behaviors? But part of it was to see if local institutions make a difference. So if you take that basic treatment effect, which anyone doing simple econometrics with a two-group mean comparison, and you further interact it with places that had the NGO versus didn't have the NGO, you see that in the communities that had NGOs and where NGOs were active, the effect was almost 30% bigger. Okay. So that same messaging, the same finance options, the same pricing policies was a lot more effective in communities where this NGO had been active over the years. Okay, and that's what this table shows. This coefficient out here of 0.14 is about 1/3 of the total effect. Okay. And we find that actually it's not just whether it's the NGO is there, but how long the NGO has been active. So every additional year of NGO's presence in the village resulted in increase in rates of improved cook stove purchase by 1%. Okay. Not just how many years, but how many numbers of projects. So how active was the NGO? Every additional project that the NGO was doing increased the purchase of ICS by 2%. Okay. And of course, this is 2020s. So nowadays, you cannot write a paper with one regression and two tables. So there is actually hundreds of this check, that check, robustness check. And that's what we mean when I was saying at the beginning, we are more careful, we are more rigorous, and our referees hold us accountable. Perhaps they get too caught up with the details, but we go through all those exercises of triple and this check and that check, and all of them more or less confirm what you see in the basic result, that the treatment effect was quite strong and robust to different specifications, different outcomes, different models. Okay, so it's a robust result. We also do some simple cost-benefit calculations and see that from a private perspective, these programs may or may not make sense, partly because the program and learning costs that was involved in figuring out who wanted what is quite high. But from a social perspective, these programs make sense because, especially electric stoves, because of the climate benefits. And so for the planetary health twist on stoves is what makes this an attractive proposition. So if you only looked at private benefits only for health, it's not good enough. But if you looked at the whole package of benefits, it does make sense. Okay. How is this relevant to implementation? So nowadays, maybe not so much in this crowd of researchers that is listening, but certainly some of the others who are listening in, randomized controlled trials are the vogue. That is, some have called the gold standard. Of course, I do experiments, but I think it's a tool. I don't think it's a gold standard. It's a very important tool. But often those randomized controlled trials are often done with NGOs. Okay, so sometimes the effect of the intervention and the intervener is confounded, because some NGOs are so convincing, they have such deep relationships with the communities, it almost doesn't matter what they are trying, it will work. And so results are not easily generalizable when NGOs aren't doing some of those studies. Okay, so unless we figure out what the effect of the implementer of the intervention is doing, it's hard to generalize. On the flip side, if they are more effective, and governments, of course, have known this for a long time, they have a major role to play in the delivery and uptake of solutions. Unfortunately, unlike other kinds of political economy questions, where we study voting and governments and we study markets, NGOs are not very often studied. They're that thing that someone does and they're too small, even though they have an outsized influence. And I deleted a bunch of slides about like how big a role they're playing nowadays, both in the research, but also in the implementation. So it's important to think about their role. Okay. And so now in the last 5 minutes, I want to pivot to it's not just what kind of research should we do, but how can we do this kind of research? And with colleagues, this last year I've been on sabbatical, I've been thinking more about a more inclusive form of science, a more inclusive form of environmental economics. Some people would call it decolonized. And the association is an example of how you need a concentration of scholars who can support each other so that your work, which is often done in Odisha, is not neglected by the larger world. It's profoundly important and it shouldn't be lost. Okay. So these problems on planetary health, a lot of that work is produced out of Harvard or London or by the WHO. And certainly on the policy side of that, the good policy economics is not being locally produced. Okay, so there are knowledge monopolies and they sit in the US, and I sit in one of them and I fight with my institution about this. They sit in Western Europe and they sit in rich countries. And unfortunately, sometimes the process of that knowledge production leads to bad questions. Okay. Firstly, it's just plain unfair. So economists like you will understand that usually we say there is a problem if there is an equity issue or there's an inefficiency issue. And the inefficiencies come from what I would say is type 3 errors. If the question is being dreamt up in Chicago or in London or in Stockholm, perhaps the question is not the relevant question. Okay. And even if the question gets answered, because it was answered by someone who's going to return to Stockholm or to London or to Washington, that the answer is never really used much in policy. Okay, so I think this is a problem when this kind of science is going on. How can we do something about it? So one example is Sandy. I saw Chandra was there earlier. I think there are a few others who have benefited from this process, and I'll talk about this in a second. Another more global example is Environment for Development Initiative, which is headquartered in Gothenburg in Sweden. Okay, so Sandy, and I think Chandra will recognize himself there in the middle. He's jumping. Is about at this point 250 plus grants across 20 years. I've been to about 40 meetings over the last 20 years. 1,500 trainees or scholars who can do this. A small secretariat, a small steering committee, and then lots of people that Sandy is working with. What does Sandy do? It's currently headquartered and sitting in EC mode in Kathmandu. Its main goal is to create local capacity to do environmental economics research, okay? So that you can generate the evidence base for informing local environmental and development policies, and to provide teaching materials for your courses. And some of you probably use some of the work produced by Sandy. And these objectives are met by training workshops, about a week long. In 2 weeks, I will go to Kathmandu and participate in what would be my, 37th RNT at this point. So I've been doing this since I was 30 years old. It provides technical support and then, of course, helping disseminate the findings. And it works in 10 countries in South Asia. And I can talk more about Sandy in a second. But another version, which is not regional and more global, is Environment for Development, which has the same interest in academic training and research collaboration, but perhaps more on policy engagement and a deep belief that the development of institutions locally is important. And it's not so much just train some people in how to do the research, but to give those people a home when they go back home to prosper as researchers. So to have a grants program, to have contract officers, research ethics. So there are these centers for excellence in, I can't even count all the countries, and I think Gunnar is here somewhere, and me drop it in the chat. In 13 to 15 countries, in certain places, of course, it has a Swedish influence, and then it has these collaboratives that work to get the centers to talk to each other, and international programs to help bring that ability to do high quality environmental economics research into the countries where those environmental and climate and planetary health problems exist. Okay, and the reason I bring up these decolonization ideas, we didn't actually know that there was this outcry in science and economics. So we've been doing this for 30 years. Is partly I will blame or credit my uncle, Professor Swadhin Pattanayak, who is the original inclusive scientist who got his PhD just around when I was born. So 50 years ago in the US, but went back to Burla and and has invested a lot of time in bringing local capacity to learn. So you all know of the Institute of Mathematics and Applications. I, of course, have suggested to him many times that the application should outweigh the pure mathematics, but he is a mathematician at heart. But beyond trying to convince the state government and other institutions that there should be local capacity to do this research, as many of you are doing in your home institutions, it's a little bit like the Mountain and Muhammad idea. If the mathematics students won't come to Bhubaneswar, he will take the teaching to the field, right? So this rural math Olympiad idea where we forget how structural barriers exist that makes it hard to learn and grow and use education as an opportunity to not just prosper and develop, but also have that science capacity. So I dedicate a lot of these ideas to Professor Swadhin Pattanayak. Hopefully he is listening and is acknowledging this. Okay. So of course he gets awards for this every now and then, but let me just leave you with the final take-home messages. The planet is in trouble. I think most of you will accept that. South Asia is in big time trouble, and India in particular. Economists have a role to play, but not by doing more or better epidemiology or more and better ecological and biodiversity science. I think our calling card and our competitive advantage is to focus on the implementation of programs and policies, and not just to then become activists who are doing things, but uncover the science behind that implementation process. What are the constraints to how to scale this up? What are the preferences of people, etc.? And the stove story was an example. And if we do that, we can hopefully avoid these type 3 errors and possibly answer the right questions. Okay, and this Himalayan example was an example of that. Okay, so with that, I'll stop and I'll field some questions. Hopefully I've left some time, but I'm sorry if I went over. I took the instruction to slow down seriously, but maybe I should have run through. Thank you.
So we'll have some few questions. I think we have still some time left. Of course, it has been such an engaging session that, I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in asking more questions. But we'll try and accommodate as many as possible and try and stick to the time limit. So the floor is open now to people who would like to seek further clarification, comments, questions, etc. Thank you.
Well,
Yes,
morning,
you are.
Good morning, Professor. So my apologies, I am not an economist in the true sense because I happen to do some economics and then I moved to marketing. So I'm now a professor of marketing, but randomized control something that interests me a lot. I have some basic training in economics, but in one of your slides, you referred to involvement of other disciplines like anthropology, sociology, and institutional aspects and how they impact policy making. And of late, I have taken interest in qualitative research, and I understand that these two paradigms don't talk to each other much. But I'm just curious, because there's a lot of insights that comes in just talking to people and conversing that how a certain intervention or treatment has impacted their lives. And don't you think that that's a limitation of experiments in the sense that some of those nuances and insights you don't really capture?
Yeah, thank you, Nivedita. I think that is absolutely 100% right. And I think almost all the work that I have done and people who work with me have taken what we would call a mixed method approach, or the QQ, or there's all kinds of fancy terms for it. But so before we launched the experiment, the one that I described, remember the fieldwork started in 2013. We spent about 2 years doing anthropological style visiting the field. For 2 years, we were just running around, not starting a study. Okay, just trying to understand why is it that the Hannah Duflo Greenstone study had shown that women in Odisha didn't seem to care about clean cooking. It amazed me because I had done the work on sanitation, and if you can convince people to change their sanitation practices, it was hard for me to understand that somehow stoves were not more attractive. And so I think mechanically, at minimum, everybody should be doing qualitative work at the beginning. Whether they do it themselves or they read and they talk and they discuss, they can then do quantitative work, but then you also should do qualitative work at the back end to see how your findings are being understood. And so in my experience, that has been the dominant way in those economists who do mixed methods applied. And I wish more people would do it. For sure, this is the right way to do it, because things like culture, norms, pressures, the things that we define as constraints are often not fully understood unless you do that qualitative work. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Professor, for the beautiful presentation, and thanks a lot. It was really
We have
nice.
T. Naik and Aruna Pattanayak, so let them please follow the same sequence.
Good evening, everyone. So may I ask regarding one of the questions that I was interested in is type 3 error that you just discussed over here. So in my understanding, this type 3 error in environmental economics or even economics and development context, so it is very much available, but in the context of environment, when we are linking environment to the development, so it will be the frequency of its appearance would be more, because environment has so many linkages, interlinkages, and whatever the studies we are doing right now, empirical studies basically, so we are doing piecemeal approach. Just like suppose say we are trying to see what kind of ecosystems are being traded off. So there we just merely highlight the identified ecosystems, and in this process, many ecosystems of which we are not able to identify, it is beyond our knowledge and capacity, we just ignore. So in that case, we can actually superficially link that this is the response to so broad many questions. So that might occur, but my concern is that although this kind of problem is very much persistent in our academic and research activities, but how to control this type 3 errors? So this is a big challenge in my understanding, that how to control it. So if you can focus on this aspect, then it would be a great help in acknowledging the things that how to treat this type 3 error. Thank you,
So
Professor.
yeah, thank you for that question and giving me another opportunity to bring up this idea. So remember, this is a little bit of a play on words. Obviously, this is not a statistical error of the kind that type 1 and type 2 are. But statisticians have also observed this, right? So Kimball, Raifa, Mitroff, and Silvers, all these guys have noticed. And what I would say is that I'm not sure how to avoid it, rather than there's no immediate solution to this. Firstly, we have to acknowledge there's a problem that we write all kinds of obscure papers that no one ever bothers to read, and certainly is not helpful to policymakers. And when they invite us to convenings and forums and to serve on committees to help, they don't know why we are there. We don't know why we are there. Partly, I think it is this idea that I think let me just go back to this colon doctrine, or this idea that you have to listen to what the policymakers are saying. So you do that before you do the research. You have to ask the practitioners. And by policymakers, I don't mean that you need 5 minutes of Naveen Patnaik's time, or like, that is not a policymaker. It's probably the secretary in the department. Below that, the NGOs who are hovering around trying to appease the secretary. Outside of that, some World Bank activist program officer. Those conversations will inform you. They'll say, "Oh, the sanitation, no, don't worry about that. Yeah, the Odisha, this is not a problem." Okay, something like that. Then you'll say, "Why is that not a problem?" Well, so it's at that stage that you discover that maybe just offering a subsidy is not something that your study needs to be shown, right? So our original study was called Shame or Subsidy. So economists will say, when there's an externality, offer a subsidy. That is a positive externality. If there's a pollution, then tax it. But the sociologists who were promoting sanitation were saying, you have to go more visceral and get into their hearts and change their minds. And you have to think about shame, make them ashamed of what is going on and why the women are being treated like this. And then they will respond, okay? So I think our whole perspective on how to promote sanitation changed because we refused to design the study till we had meaningful conversations with the world of practice, right? What are they asking for? What are they saying is important? So engaging the practitioners and policymakers is the number one way to implement this Colin doctrine of, listen carefully, talk less. Be like the elephant, not like the hippo. And then you will possibly ask the right question and not the wrong question. And you're right, in the environment, there are lots and lots of questions. But every seminar speaker you hear from this point onwards, I challenge many of you, including me, you can ask, well, what are you going to do with this information once you have it? Say your study works beautifully and you get the result, and you've got this result. What should we do? So I sit in a public policy school, and every time someone comes to apply for a job and gives a job talk and makes a presentation, my colleagues are all harassing them about, your design, your statistical, your sample size, your identification problems, theory. And I just wait for it all to end and I'm saying, why are you asking this question? You're coming to a policy school. You're not coming to an economics department. We are economists. What are you going to do with this information? Who wants to know the answer to this? And what will they do? Once you challenge them to do that, some of them have answers. Some of them have answers and some don't. And that to me is a signal of the potential for type 3 error. So I don't think there's an easy answer other than to what you're seeing on the slide, engaging the policy people at the front end. So often we are saying, oh, we've got a result, and now let's just go to the government and tell them this is interesting. Okay. Especially if you have a healthy relationship with the donor and the funder, and where there's a give and take, they tell you this is not good, and you tell them we can't study that, and then you change something, and then it's a good trade-off. Sorry, my answer was long-winded, Professor Mok.
Arunab, I think this will be the last question.
Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
Yeah, let me ask a very general question. I want to ask Professor Pattanayak. He's been observing the country for very long, from very far, and also visiting it and trying to see how policies are being implemented, environmental policies. Does he feel that over the years there is a fundamental change in the approach of policymakers, in the thinking and sensitivity towards the environment over the last 20, 30 years that he must be observing India as a country and how it's performing? That's the first part of the question. Second is that we always, every time there's a climate conference or environment conference happens, we have North-South debate. Now, it's from a sitting in a developing country, sitting in India, one feels that yeah, we're justified in doing it. But how does he view that this debate? I mean, I just want to know his views about the North-South debate.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Tony?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, trust you to ask hard questions at the end of a long presentation. But for sure, 100%, I will endorse the first point that things in India are looking up in terms of acknowledging that the environment needs help, putting policies into place to try to do something about it, acknowledging that science has a role, enabling science organizations to use some of that information. But part of it is because we were starting from such a low level. So I think I first started working in India almost 22 years ago. I didn't start in India. I was working in Indonesia, Brazil, and finally had the guts to take on this huge issue in a huge country with so many different problems. And I can tell you that 20 years ago, when I walked into the Ministry of Health, they said, go away. The environment has nothing to do with health. And what are you? You're such a big economist. You're talking about hand washing and sanitation in Odisha. Like, what is this? But then things have changed. Now, not just because of me, but because of other scholars, the JPALs and many organizations establishing policy offices in Delhi, embedding themselves in the ministry, Niti Aayog. There is definitely a recognition. The number of IITs and other groups that are doing this is fantastic. Okay. Can more be done? For sure. I don't want to comment on the centralization of power and how, because fundamentally environmental problems are very peculiar and local. And so it's hard for Delhi to say what is going on in Jharkhand or in Tripura or in somewhere in Madhya Pradesh, right? And so sort of decentralizing that would be a good idea. Many institutes are opening up. Whether they have the ability to make decisions is a different matter, right? So that's that. So the second question about the North-South is profoundly important. And you should think of me as an ambassador of the South and the North, embedded in the North, yelling at my colleagues that it's unfair. So I can only talk about the research policy space, right? I don't want to get into like who should emit how much carbon, and there are other people who can do that. But this whole idea of decolonizing the science, right? So what are we trying to do? We are saying that not all the science can be produced out of Harvard and London School. Some of that science has to be produced out of Ravenshaw College, out of Utkal University, out of NICER, because it is just unsustainable that you say you have a problem, you need to solve it, we will solve it for you. This is another form of tide A. And that's what EFD, Sandy, and these institutions that I've spent my non-research time with, but on the teaching of the research, has been totally believing in, okay? That we have a voice in the negotiation between the North and the South only if the scholars locally have the capacity to do it, right? Otherwise, so I guess it's a form of democratization of the process, of sharing of the problem by at least taking that scientific production out, and maybe you'll ask more relevant questions, and maybe there'll be more acknowledgement of the problem inside India if local scientists have ownership of that problem and are leading that charge rather than being told by, even if it's an Indian origin scientist sitting at Harvard saying, you're emitting too much. Maybe there's another jugaad solution here, right, which we are very good at. But thank you.
Nirmal Babu, I think you have a question, and that's the real last question. Nirmal?
Nirmal sir, you can unmute and
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
You are.
Yes, you are.
Thank you.
Yeah. We know Swadhin Babu of mathematics in Parampur University. He visited the university several times. So what he is in mathematics is what Subhrendu Babu is for environmental economics. That you really incentivize the people and the government for that. The second observation I make is right from Pigu's work, we are really concerned with those institutions, incentives, and governance. He did it with relation to welfare economics, but it was incentive through some kind of taxation and institution with reference to the externalities that he had really outlined. Then we had in 20th century the work of Ronald Coase. Now, therefore, for our last 100 years, we are in that kind of an issue. How do we deal with institutions, incentives, and governance concerning environment? And as economists and researchers, we don't have any other way to convince the politics about the urgency of the health of the planet. But one study I would probably require a kind of a answer is, for a village near Berhampur University, we had the biomass fuel study. And there we found that only solar energy is more sustainable in comparison to the biomass fuel. Because electricity, whether it is through your fossil fuel-based, coal-based, or hydro-based, or atomic-based, may not be that very sustainable in a macro global perspective in comparison to solar. If in your Himalayan study, if you were looking at the solar energy as a cooking medium, then it's okay. But if you are referring to other forms of electricity, maybe while we save Himalaya, we may not save the planet. Now, what is your reaction to this kind of an observation? We did a study with the botany department in Berhampur University for a village where biomass-based cooking medium and their chullas and other things. We did some study some 20, 30 years ago. I'm a retired professor from Berhampur University in economics. Subhrendu, your observation.
Thank you for that comment, Professor Sahu. And firstly, congratulations on working with the botany department. I think more work between economists and botanists would be important. And so you're 100% right that what works in the Himalayas may not work in Ganjam or in Berhampur. What works in India may not work in Bangladesh. What works in South Asia may not be true in Africa. And I think you're hopefully helping make my points that, of course, we understand, like Pigu and Coase, that if there is an externality, we should tax it. It's negative. If it's a subsidy, we should subsidize it. If parties can negotiate and solve the problem. So too much of economics has been at that very, very high level and carbon taxes, whereas too little has been on the practicalities of what works in Berhampur and what doesn't work in Sambalpur and what works in Madhya Pradesh and doesn't work in Tamil Nadu. And that leads to my point about decolonizing and in doing more inclusive economics, where I'm not saying that only Odias can work in Odisha and only Telugus can work in Andhra Pradesh or something like that, but they should be based in institutions that are locally. At least they should be partners in the research, and too much of the science production process is highly colonized, highly centralized with these knowledge monopolies. And that is what leads to these kinds of absurd answers that stoves are going up in smoke in Berhampur. Well, If you actually lived there and you asked the women what they want, you would have given them the stove that they would have liked to use, not the one that you wanted to test. And then it would have worked. And so I do have solar studies going on in multiple countries, including in Myanmar, because I agree with you that if the electricity is fossil fuel based, then that's a bad idea. But do I know this answer everywhere? So we need lots and lots of applied microeconomists who are working by application. I mean, in the spirit of the first question, working with other disciplines from business schools, doing qualitative methods, but also who are working with the biogas engineers to understand what that, I think you just have to leave the world of textbooks, enough of that. And because we have real problems and we have to get into the field. And I acknowledge the association for creating a forum and a venue for the group to be able to do this together, right? And I think I got more people to listen to me now than when I've come to Odisha to the Institute of Mathematics and Application and to Utkal University and present. Then, 20 years ago, if you said you wanted to talk about the environment, firstly, I didn't look like I knew anything, which is probably true today too. But to Aruna Patnaik's point, I think there is more appreciation of environmental problems and more appreciation that local researchers can do something about it, and they have the resources to do something about it. Thank you again.
Though we have overshot our time, I think we have last question. I think I don't want to disappoint the last person who wants to seek some clarification to you. Just very
Yes, sir.
quickly.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I'm a PhD student. I'm just curious to know that why it is difficult to understand the methodology part and also the mathematical part, as I have solved lots of mathematical model, but still I cannot develop mine. Actually, I want to know how can I develop my knowledge to do this kind of research work. It's just a general question.
Okay, so that's a really challenging question. Firstly, Namita Rani, don't ever lose hope. Just because there's a mathematical problem in front of you doesn't mean it needs to be solved. Maybe sometimes you don't need to work on that problem. You can do other things, right? And I'm not saying you're not capable of doing mathematics, but I don't think mathematics is needed right now. With the problems are clear to us. The solutions are what we need to work on, and it's mathematics is not necessarily the pathway. I suggest you reach out to some of the members in the association who are affiliated with Sandy. Sandy is an organization that promotes, as I said, training of scholars like you and you would come to some workshops and maybe have a proposal and work on that. That might be the most practical way to learn about these kinds of questions right now. Yeah, but
Yes.
don't lose hope. Huh?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
I think we'll stop the Q&A at this point. And
Sir, I think Professor Udayshankar Mishra has.
Okay. Udayo, I didn't see that. I'm sorry, Udayo, please.
In the chat window.
Okay, I didn't see that. Please go ahead, Udayo. He's too.
Yeah, he has written that. Sir,
I know. I've seen his query. I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think Professor Pattanayak is a very exciting talk, and I was more excited even for your reference to my beloved teacher, Professor Swadhin Pattanayak. I'm one of his students of the 80s. In fact, when I was listening to you, I was remembering something that you are very much harping on the fact of evidence. Basically, what is scientific evidence? And in my classes when I teach, because I teach statistics and I refer to robustness of evidence, I was wondering that whether I can ask you this to clarify to me that if a particular evidence, its reliability, would you actually attribute it to its consistency more or its replicability more? Because in your content of the lecture, you did refer to certain things as how much replicable it is, how much consistent it is, because we have a range of empirical evidence from different contexts. Am I right? So I was just thinking that if you try to reflect upon that, what would you say?
No, that we worry about that a lot, and I think we have gone through. Economists only know two kinds of curves, right? The S and the U. So we have
Yeah, exactly.
we we have gone through like a U shape in a Kuznets sense, from
Yes, yes.
the field being very theoretical, so not people grabbing some global statistics and estimating angle curves and this and that with
Yeah.
bad data, to moving towards a lot of interest in replication, on improving the quality of your evidence and doing trials and repeating the trial. I think my meta point is that now in that process we become too narrow. We are asking smaller and smaller questions because we can control it, and the quality of the evidence is very good, and we convince each other, look how good my study is, there's nothing else that could confound it, and the same study was done elsewhere. Whereas the problem calls for 1,000 experiments. Maybe they're not fully replicable, because the policymaker is not looking for 99% significance level, right?
Yeah.
Scientists, our evidentiary standards are so different. If there's 1% doubt that out of 100 trials, one is wrong, we want to reject it. They're very good. They're happy if it's 51 out of 100, right? Because they don't have anything. So in our obsession with perfection, we are throwing out lots of good, careful projects. So that is really the spirit of my comment. I think that's, and I think my uncle would agree, but who knows? He said it was too early for him to wake up. He's in Seattle. Yeah.
Okay.
Amarendra, shall we conclude now?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. So I think we have had an extremely, thought-provoking and engaging lecture. The quality of questions that we came up during the session, despite the couple of minutes of stunned silence, as you said, is absolutely fascinating. I must say, I have been involved in policy making and policy implementation for close to 40 years, and the points that you have brought up is absolutely spot on. I can't really I wish we had this kind of introspection in the 80s and 90s. Maybe India would have produced much better policies. And you have made the presentation with such clarity that really one doesn't need to sum up much. But let me, despite that, highlight 4 key messages that came out very strongly. And the first one is absolutely, because one of our own teachers, Dr. Minal Dattejyoti, used to keep saying all the time, ask the right question. He always used to say the most important thing is to identify the right question. And you have gone a step further and added one more. Not only ask the right question, find out which is the irrelevant question and why are we looking for solutions to that. And that type 3 error issue that you highlighted is absolutely, there is no point chasing absolutely precise answers to a precisely wrong problem. And many of us have been guilty of that. And that's the second key message. The third is the multidisciplinary research that is required to design and crafting good policies, and also good implementation design. That's very, very important. I think many of our failures have been the last mile, and last mile is really important. We sit in Krishi Bhavan, we sit in Niti Aayog Bhavan, we sit in this thing, we craft policies, but we have, as you have rightly said, that we have spent far little time, effort, research, R&D on this last mile issues. And of late, and I agree with you, of late, this has been something, is a change in policy making paradigm and architecture in India. And that's And the fourth key message, and I strongly, I didn't know your relationship with Dr. Swadhin Pattanayak, and also your other uncle, Vivek Pattanayak, who is a very close friend of mine. I didn't know that. But I can see clearly the imprint of what he has been, and the localization of knowledge production and research is absolute, and decolonization of research and knowledge is absolutely, again, something that we strongly endorse. You have given many, many more messages, but absolutely fascinating talk. I can't thank you enough for that. And I must thank Chandrasekhar Babu for really connecting with you, that really on this very important occasion of World Environment Day, we have had such a thought-provoking lecture, which really has made our day. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now let's have a formal vote of thanks from Sikta.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I am extremely humbled. At the same time, I feel really privileged to express my heartfelt thanks to all those who had made it possible for this session. I would like to start by thanking our OEA team who have always been thoughtful in conceptualizing the sessions, which are very much apt to the need of the hour, and taking up initiatives for its sustainability. I would like to extend my gratitude to our President, Dr. Jugal Mahapatra sir, who have been our guiding lights, imparting wisdom and knowledge to us and nurturing our society. Sir, I must say that your unwavering support has been instrumental in taking our association into scale-ups. I'm extremely thankful and express my sense of appreciation to our guest of honor, Professor Subhrendu sir, who have taken out his valuable time out of his busy schedule and has enlightened us with those aspects of planetary health hazards, the issues which are very emerging research, and has given an insight to our researcher in order to work in this area. So yes, of course, we are running after a healthy lifestyle, but how healthy is our environment? That needs to be looked into and needs special attention. Thank you for, sir, taking us up into the various facets of the issues of the research and the disseminating of findings. We would like to hear from you further in our sessions. If you can ask our OEA team that we send, sir, if you are coming to Odisha, we would really be happy to invite you and hear from you in a physical mode. Finally, I would like to thank each one of us, those are present, Professor Uday sir, and all the senior professors, all the esteemed members of OEA present over here, and all those participants who had made it possible of more than 1.5 hours of session and yet making the session a great productive. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Pattanayak.
Thank you. Thank you.